Don Knotts, the comedic genius who gave belly laughs to audiences for decades, passed away 15 years ago, but his legacy as one of Hollywood's finest actors continues to thrive even today. Fans loved Don for more than just his comedic timing. He also set a great example for others to follow. Karen Knotts, Don's daughter, shocked fans when she broke her silence recently to confirm professional speculations. Here is Don Knotts, his life, and rumors about his career. Early life. During his childhood, Jesse Donald Knotts, who was born in Morgantown, West Virginia, in the year 1994, was confronted with a number of challenges. Author Daniel DeVise, in his book Andy and Don, The Making of a Friendship and a Classic American TV Show, reveals a story that is marked by adversity. The author does this by delving into his formative years. Knotts, who was an unanticipated addition to the family, followed his nearest sibling by 14 years after his arrival. His two elder brothers shared lodgings with a family boarder, which resulted in Knotts being relegated to a cot in the kitchen. This occurred within the context of a crowded household. His father, Jesse, was unable to leave his bed because of the incapacitating health problems he was experiencing. The New York Times makes reference to his struggle with hysterical blindness, while Closer Weekly portrays him as an alcoholic who suffers from schizophrenia to an extreme degree. A difficult upbringing was endured by the young Knotts, who were responsible for navigating a household that was plagued by disorder. Unfortunately, the attack was continuous, and memories of it did not come to light until much later in life. Knotts' mother, Elsie, caused him to recall a horrific event that occurred when he was 30 years old. The event involved his father brandishing a knife as a threat. In addition, the issues were made even more difficult by the layout of the Knotts' residence. Whenever little Don needed to move from his sleeping quarters in the kitchen to any other section of the home, he had to make his way via the living room, where his father was restricted to the sofa. Avoiding the dangers turned into a daily struggle, which contributed to the pervasive tension that existed in the environment overall. Unsurprisingly, Knotts' mental and physical health suffered a significant amount as a result of the situation. When he was a young boy, he displayed vulnerable characteristics, such as being pale, underweight, and constantly sick. A gloomy perspective was reflected in his thoughts later in life, which were as follows: "I did not come into the world with a great deal of promise." The trajectory of Don Knotts' life was unquestionably influenced by this stormy backdrop of difficulty, which played a role in the development of his comedic brilliance and his tenacity in the face of personal adversities. To better understand the man who brought the memorable role of Deputy Sheriff Barney Fife to life, we're going to take a closer look at his life. Relationship with brothers. By virtue of the fact that they were brothers-in-law, Daniel DeVise, the author of Andy and Don, The Making of a Friendship and a Classic American TV Show, had a special familial connection with Don Knotts. For the purpose of shedding light on a family life that was burdened with the weight of complexity, DeVise reveals, inside the pages of his book, the intricate dynamics of Knotts' relationships, notably with his brothers. As per DeVise's account, the brothers were indistinguishable from the ephemeral individuals who frequently visited their residence on University Avenue, highlighting the presence of an environment that was characterized by an air of unpredictability. According to the New York Times, Knotts' older brothers, William, Earl, and Sid, brought a sense of humor to the difficult conditions that they were going through. In an atmosphere where there was a dearth of laughter, their humorous initiatives acted as a unique light. However, there was a more sinister side to this humor. After some time had passed, Karen Knotts, Knotts' daughter, revealed to Closer Weekly that her father was not spared from the cruelty that occurred within the family context. The brothers, who were frequently under the influence of alcohol, were involved in a number of heated arguments on a regular basis. Tragically, Shadow passed away from an asthma attack during one of these disagreements. The hard reality of losing a sister was something that Knotts had to face when he was still in his adolescent years. A heartbreaking picture is painted by the environment in which Knotts was raised, which was characterized by disagreement within the family and the premature death of a sibling. In this turbulent household, the specter of fear loomed large, making it difficult to comprehend the emotional toll that it took on a young Don Knotts. In order to find comfort in the face of such suffering, Knotts found inspiration in the domain of imagination. It was revealed by the Los Angeles Review of Books that he found sanctuary by populating his personal space with imagined characters and indulging in the enactment of joyful stories. This was a coping mechanism that enabled him to negotiate the tough terrain of his reality, high school, and freedom. There was a glimmer of relief that emerged from the pervading anxiety that characterized Don Knotts' early home life as he transitioned into his adolescent years. One of the most significant turning points in his life was the demise of his father when he was only 13 years old. As a result of the weight of his father's control being lifted, Don Knotts, who is now old enough to exercise influence over his remaining sibling, found relief from the domestic turmoil, according to Karen Knotts, his daughter, who recounted the story to Closer Weekly. The small youngster, who had previously been terrified, started to feel a sense of stability eventually. When Knotts was in high school, he underwent a miraculous transformation that turned out to be a defining moment in his life. The flowering of her father was something that Karen witnessed during this time period, and she mentioned to Closer Weekly that he just blossomed. His path was one of rise, with him becoming class president, writing a piece for the yearbook, becoming popular, and sharing the company of a best friend. This marked a significant difference from the solitude he had been forced to endure. However, in an interview with the Los Angeles Times in 1976, Don Knotts admitted that he was going through an internal conflict during this time of his professional life. Despite the fact that Knotts had achieved a lot in the outside world, he admitted, "I felt like a loser." The difficulties he was experiencing financially and his personal concerns, particularly with regard to his physical stature, continued to be the source of his unhappiness. Despite the fact that it might have appeared to be an era of victory, the backdrop of economic troubles and a perceived lack of sufficiency cast shadows over it. It was during these formative years, typically around the time that Don Knotts was in his early teens, that he found an improbable companion in the character of Danny. Danny was a person. It is not a human confidant, but rather a dummy used by ventriloquists. It was with this dummy that he began his adventure into the world of performance, where he utilized the art of ventriloquism as a means of expressing his creative side. When Knotts was confronted with personal difficulties, the ventriloquist act he performed with Danny turned out to be a transforming venture. This exemplifies Knotts' tenacity and resourcefulness in addressing his feelings through the medium of the entertainment industry. Rumors of military career. Don Knotts died 15 years ago, and now his family confirms the rumors surrounding his military service and mental health struggles. The beloved comic's past as a strict Marine Corps drill instructor has been the subject of an erroneous but long-running story. According to Snopes, this whole idea is completely false and fits in with other urban legends that make up stories about celebrities playing outlandish military duties, including the one about Mr. Rogers being a sniper in the military. Despite what you might have heard about the drill instructor, Knotts actually had a valid military record. Because of his weak and malnourished look, his enrollment was met with widespread mistrust as World War II broke out, but he found acceptance and even recognition of his exceptional abilities within the military. According to the New York Times, Knotts joined the comic group Stars and Gripes, whose mission was to amuse the American troops stationed in the Pacific. Together, We Served highlights Knotts' versatility and devotion to the war cause by noting that he not only contributed humorous elements, but also stepped in as a nurse when called upon. Knotts met an older comic named Red Ford while serving in the military. He was still developing his skills with his ventriloquist dummy, Danny. The young performer was profoundly affected by Ford's remarks, and they continue to speak to him to this day. "You know something?" Ford said with profound poignancy. A memorable experience for Knotts. "You're a funny guy," provided insight into his early years as a comedian. Clearing up the myth of the drill instructor reveals the true story of Don Knotts' military career, which was marked by friendship, comedy, and a desire to cheer up his fellow service members in the Pacific Theater. Knotts' life reached a turning point when his humor and military service intersected, launching a career that would delight and entertain people all over the globe. How he got roles. After serving in the military with a degree in education from West Virginia University in 1948, Don Knotts set out on the difficult path to establish himself in the cutthroat world of entertainment. According to the LA Times, Knotts made his way to New York City with only $100, where he felt the first pain of rejection, something that many aspiring performers go through. Refusing to let up, he kept trying to get radio gigs until he landed a role on a soap opera despite a string of failures. But genuine renown eluded him, and Knotts had to persevere for 7 long years before he finally made it to Broadway, a watershed moment in his career. During this time, he met Andy Griffith, who would later become a lifetime friend and co-star in the comedy play No Time for Sergeants. Following this partnership, Knotts established himself as the go-to actor for a certain type of character, an anxious, neurotic, and fundamentally harmless individual. The New York Times highlights an interesting facet of his ascent, showing that Knotts was not opposed to plagiarizing, a tactic that was unexpectedly unexpectedly well received by the people whose work he appropriated. The New York Times reports that this odd dynamic arose because of the industry's admiration for Knotz's special talent. His depiction of frail, skinny, and anxious characters had a specific function: to bolster the manhood of other male performers and comedians. Because of Knotz, his co-stars in the entertainment industry seemed to be one step closer to leading men. Personality and family. The private life of the legendary comedian Don Knotz is filled with complications and romances that last 3 marriages. Knotz's love life developed through the years as he was characterized by Buddy Alcheco as a ladies' man who wished he could sing like Frank Sinatra. From 1947 until their 1964 divorce, he was married to Catherine Metz. 2 children were born to this union: Thomas Knotz, a son, and Karen Knotz, a daughter who would one day join her famous performing father on stage. Knotz eagerly took on the role of single parent once his marriage to Metz ended, a responsibility he never wavered from. Unfortunately, Knotz's second marriage to Laura Lee Chuchna, when he tied the knot in 1974, was not without its problems, and the couple eventually divorced in 1983. Despite the difficulties of his previous marriages, Knotz married Frances Yarborough for the third and last time in 2002. They remained married until Knotz's demise in 2006. The Andy Griffith Show co-star Betty Lynn gave an insight into Knotz's private nature, calling him a very quiet man and very sweet, which was a complete change from his legendary portrayal of Barney Fife on film. The contrast between the energetic characters he played and the guy he was when he wasn't acting is hinted at by this glimpse into Knotz's reserved personality. Television writer Mark Evanier gave Knotz a moving eulogy, calling him the most beloved person in all of show business. This emotion captures the deep influence and affection that Knotz had on individuals in the industry. It highlights the lasting impact of a man who made people laugh and who also touched the hearts of his colleagues. Struggle with anxiety and hypochondria. By playfully proposing himself for the position to Andy Griffith, the genius behind the renowned character Barney Fife, Don Knotz took a fortunate step into television history. The LA Times reports that Knotz made the proposal with a hint of humor, but Griffith enthusiastically accepted, setting the stage for a television collaboration that would turn out to be a perfect fit for the showbiz power couple. Knotz broke through to a level of fame that many would-be comedians and performers dream of with this key role. But behind the scenes of her television celebrity, Knotz battled with her own demons. The Charlotte Observer reported on the story of writer Daniel DeVise, who said that Knotz struggled with severe feelings of inadequacy for a long time before he broke through with Andy Griffith. He might spend days in bed before going on stage because the performance requirements would drive him to despair. In the 1950s, Knotz sought relief from his uneasiness by taking prescribed anti-anxiety drugs. He had a complicated web of personal problems, with hypochondria and severe sleeplessness interwoven throughout. A defining feature of Knotz's life, according to DeVise, as described by the LA Review of Books, was his insomnia, which was fostered in part by his late-night adventures and his penchant for the company of various women. Nevertheless, he pulled off the unexpected feat of letting go of these vices. An overdose of sleeping medication and a threat from his third wife were the turning points in his life. In the face of the crushing weight of his practice's repercussions, Knotz experienced a sea change, marking a break from his destructive habits. The dark corners of his television triumph expose a multifaceted human struggling with the trifecta of stardom, inner turmoil, and the search for inner peace. From the playful suggestion that defined his television legacy to the personal challenges that emphasized his public persona, Don Knotz's journey beautifully captures the ups and downs of a comic genius's life, both on and off screen. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick, as we explore the personal struggles of Don Knotz, his life, and the rumor his daughter confirmed about his career. It's hard to ignore the fact that despite being a man with humorous antics up his sleeve all the time, his reality wasn't quite comical. The man died 15 years ago, and now his family has confirmed the rumors about his fight with anxiety and addiction. And according to his daughter, a part of him blamed the glitz and glamour of Hollywood for all his issues. And that's probably why he wasn't keen on Karen Knotz following in his footsteps to become an actor. In fact, while there was a lot of love between Don and Karen, they disagreed on one major thing when Karen was a young teen. Don clearly didn't want his daughter to enter the show business, but Karen, who believed that Don was a great father, wanted to act for as long as she could remember. Back in 2011, she told the Murfreesboro Post, "I always wanted to be an actress even when I was young, but he said, no, that's not a good life for a child." Don saw firsthand how difficult the business was. He wanted to protect his daughter from a life of hardship and disappointment. She went on to say, "He was afraid for me because he had seen so many people friends over time that couldn't make it in show business and had so much talent. He tried to talk me out of it for a while. However, Karen's passion for show business persisted, and eventually she managed to bring Don on board. Do you think he was right to have his reservations? Let us know in the comments below. Therapy. According to Karen Knotts, Don's daughter, things came back to haunt him. This testifies to the lasting impact of Don's difficult childhood, even if the poor West Virginia youngster eventually achieved success. Those difficult formative years marked the comedy icon forever. The LA Review of Books cites author Daniel DeVise as saying that one of Knotts' problems was that he couldn't make sense of the contrasting elements in his life. He played meek, anxious, and often comical roles on screen. At the same time, he achieved success like never before, beyond anything he had imagined. As a result of this discord, Knotts had to face the contradiction between his actual accomplishments and the personas he played. At one point in his career, Knotts was seen by DeVise visiting the office of a Hollywood therapist, where he fervently vented his frustrations at God in an effort to overcome his depression, self-doubt, and the influence of his Bible-thumping father. Karen Knotts recalled her father's complex personality, saying he was mercurial and prone to shifting between different states of mind. She opened up about her struggles with depression and how she was there for him when he was battling an unending stream of negative thoughts that were dragging him down. In spite of everything, Karen saw her father undergo a personal transformation, and she was very proud of his strength in the face of the obstacles that had plagued him. It is a tribute to the immense effort Don Knotts put into fostering happiness that he had overcome internal struggles by the time he passed away. His impact goes beyond the joy he offered to audiences through his deep love for humanity, as Karen pointed out. Underappreciated. Don Knotts' retirement from The Andy Griffith Show is accompanied by a mix of causes, each adding to the story of his departure. The decision to depart, according to Knotts' daughter Karen, who was quoted in Closer Weekly, was driven by the extreme workload and the understanding that the show's format could only accommodate a certain amount of stories. Her words to describe it were, hard work. However, there's a somewhat different take on things over at the LA Times, which states that Knotts had only planned to commit to 5 seasons when the show started, and he stuck to that. His sincere statement to the Times in 1967 was, "The grind gets to you in television, and that's primarily the reason I'm concentrating on pictures." A desire to escape the hectic schedule of television and enter the world of filmmaking is reflected in this statement. Despite not having Knotts on the show regularly, it continued to air as The Andy Griffith Show. Nevertheless, both audiences and critics agreed that Knotts' departure rendered the show lifeless and generic, adding it to the annals of 1960s television. Even though their careers took different paths, Andy Griffith and Don Knotts remained friends. Their friendship lasted long after the show ended, which is a great sign of how real their bond was. But unlike Knotts' expectations, the adaptation for the big screen was a rocky road. After he left television, he signed a 5-picture deal with Universal. Looking back, we can see that films like The Incredible Mr. Limpet, The Reluctant Astronaut, and The Ghost and Mr. Chicken were truly exceptional. Particularly influential were subsequent comedians like Martin Short and Jim Carrey, who listed Knotts as a major influence, and The Incredible Mr. Limpet, which was an early example of the combination of live action with animation. Knotts did not get the critical praise he was hoping for at the time, despite these contributions. Blindness. Macular degeneration is a condition that is described in great depth by the Mayo Clinic. Don Knotts was diagnosed with macular degeneration at the comparatively young age of 57, which was a depressing diagnosis. This condition impairs a person's ability to see directly ahead, causing them to see objects that are adjacent to them in their line of sight to appear distorted and blurry. When the condition is more severe, it can advance to the point where it makes it difficult to recognize faces, which is a form of vision impairment that becomes increasingly debilitating over time. A profound sense of loss was something that Knotts struggled with as a result of the difficulties that were associated with macular degeneration. According to the New York Times, he openly discussed his problem and admitted to having experienced a significant amount of despair at one point in his life. Knotts, in a moment of self-reflection, expressed a profound realization. "I bet a blind person would give his right arm to have the vision I have." This was a moment that proved to be transforming for Knotts. This shift of perspective turned out to be a defining moment, demonstrating Knotts' tenacity in the face of a challenging medical prognosis by resulting in the discovery of consolation. Knotts continued to follow through with his professional aspirations, despite the fact that his vision difficulties were getting worse. In accordance with the American Macular Degeneration Foundation, he continued to participate in the activity that he valued the most, which was swimming laps. However, the unrelenting advancement of his macular degeneration eventually brought him to a point where he was unable to carry out fundamental activities, such as reading or driving. The narrative of Don Knotts' life takes an emotional turn when macular degeneration, an invisible foe that steadily undermined the clarity of his environment, is introduced. This degeneration is the cause of the emotional turn. Don Knotts' daughter left him at his demise to laugh. In early 2000, Don Knotts faced a somber diagnosis of lung cancer, as reported by Closer Weekly. Despite a period of relative detachment from his longtime friend Andy Griffith, Griffith swiftly rallied by Knotts' side, offering unwavering support throughout the challenging journey. Nancy Stafford, their Matlock co-star, recounted the poignant reunion, emphasizing the seamless reconnection between Knotts and Griffith. In their shared moments, characterized by singing, laughter, and the exchange of jokes, the duo effortlessly fell back into their familiar camaraderie. Stafford marveled at their remarkable communication, portraying a bond that transcended the passage of time. Regrettably, the battle with cancer proved insurmountable for Knotts, marking the conclusion of his remarkable life. 14 years after his passing, his daughter Karen opened up about her lingering regrets regarding her father's final moments, as conveyed through Closer Weekly. Karen Knotts painted a vivid picture of her father's enduring sense of humor, describing it as completely, insanely natural. In the face of his terminal illness, she revealed that even during those challenging times, Don Knotts had the ability to elicit fits of laughter from those around him. Recounting a poignant moment, Karen shared that her father's witty remark or action prompted her and her stepmother to burst into hysterical laughter. However, Karen expressed regret for leaving her father's side to share in the laughter, a decision she later questioned. Reflecting on this pivotal moment, Karen recounted a conversation with director Howard Storm, who advised her that she should have stayed, laughed wholeheartedly, and allowed her father to hear the joyous sound. Acknowledging Storm's insight, Karen reflected on the missed opportunity to fully embrace the humor and connection that laughter could have brought to that poignant moment. The final chapter of Don Knotts' life unfolds as a delicate balance between laughter and the solemnity of illness. The profound impact of his humor endured even in the face of mortality, leaving an indelible imprint on those who shared his final moments. Karen Knotts' contemplation serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities inherent in navigating the emotions surrounding a loved one's departure, offering insights into the enduring legacy of a man whose laughter resonates beyond the confines of time. Demise. On February 24, 2006, the world bid farewell to Don Knotts, and in the poignant final moments, one of the last individuals to share his bedside was none other than his cherished friend, Andy Griffith, as reported by People. Griffith recounted the heartfelt exchange, expressing his love and holding Knotts' hand, noting that there were perceptible movements in Knotts' chest, suggesting he may have heard his dear friend's parting words. Decades before his passing, Knotts had made the commendable decision to quit smoking. Even in the face of his lung cancer diagnosis, he maintained a remarkably positive outlook. Surprisingly, he chose not to disclose the details of his chemotherapy to his children, opting instead to project an image of resilience and an unwavering determination to overcome the adversity that had entered his life. In his optimistic vision, this was merely a transient hurdle, a minor bump in the road that he intended to navigate with the same vigor that had defined his illustrious career. The official cause of Don Knotts' passing was attributed to pulmonary and respiratory complications. Reports hinted at unspecified health issues that had prompted the cancellation of his appearances in the years leading up to his demise. In the aftermath of his departure, those closest to Knotts fondly remembered the man who had left an indelible mark on the world of entertainment. Andy Griffith paid tribute to his friend's modesty, humility, and intelligence, describing Knotts as a bright soul. Ron Howard, another member of the Knotts inner circle, echoed the sentiment, highlighting Knotts' genuine kindness that endeared him to all who knew him. We hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you in the next one.